Right, so I'm delighted to be joined by Dan Kaszeta. He is an Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and recently wrote the book Toxic, about the history of nerve agents. Thank you for joining us, Dan.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me out here.
I was going to start by asking, do you see a future for chemical warfare in the kind of the wider military sphere, or do you think it's going to be used more with kind of terrorist attacks? Obviously, we had the attack in Japan, we've had kind of attacks elsewhere.
I see chemical warfare, fortunately, as mostly of historical interest. As a form of warfare. The reason why we don't see it more often, it's an exotic sort of odd thing when it does happen. I mean, the reason why we don't see it more often than we do is actually it hasn't lived up to its promises. It's an area where conventional forms of lethality have progressed in their sort of military utility and predictability and general usefulness in ways that, chemical weapons stopped advancing in about 1960.
Yeah, and of course, in the Second World War, Hitler, of course, was developing gases like tabun, but he never used them. I mean, why did he do that?
Well, yes, you're right. If you look at my book Toxic, I get a whole history of that Nazi nerve agent program. I mean, a number of reasons. One was, even by then, people had kind of clocked the idea that it wasn't the most useful form of warfare. There was a heavy legacy of the First World War, wherein you couldn't really point to many instances where chemical warfare actually won a battle. Second, the Nazi nerve agent program was largely a personal enrichment program. Various corporate executives were actually getting quite wealthy on it and, getting a lot of money off the regime. But I think more importantly, various people in the German government, all the way up to and allegedly including Hitler, were firm in their belief that Western chemical industry in Britain and America, Shell Oil, ICI, DuPont, Monsanto, that these large corporate giants, which in many other ways were more advanced than the German chemical industry, they had assumed that, of course, the Americans must have nerve agents, so therefore we just need this to deter them, possible use. So they were convinced that the rest of the world was more advanced than they were. It turns out they weren't.
And of course, who actually still has gas? Who actually use this? I mean, I presume in Syria.
Yeah, we're fortunate in that we can really mark off most of the world map here. We've seen chemical warfare used in Syria in a number of horrific incidents. We have an inconvenient black spot on the map in the form of North Korea. There's the matter of Egypt. Egypt's not ever owned up to its chemical warfare past. It's not signed up to the Chemical Weapons Convention. Hasn't ratified the treaty, so has not disclosed its old historic program. So we really don't know if they still have a chemical weapons program or not, where that is. There's some questions about Israel, but these are pockets of holdouts. And then there's, of course, the big question, Russia, because, not very far from here, one of the last times I was down in this part of the world was doing actual field work in Salisbury, retracing the steps of GRU assassins. But having said that, there's a world of difference between the amount of stuff that was put on Sergei Skripal's door handle and what is actually needed for warfare. So that's like, practically any nation state, if it wanted to, could have a vial or a jug of this stuff. That's not the same as nation state level chemical warfare.
And of course, we touched upon World War I very briefly, chlorine gas, mustard gas. Yeah. Would you say it was used as a terror weapon? Did it actually have any impact on the battlefield at all?
I think it had some effect. If you look through the history of the First World War, what you had was a period of diminishing marginal returns, because every time a new chemical weapons started to be used, and then new chemicals would be introduced. With each successive, with the start in each successive change in technology, there was a defensive arms race. Gas masks, decontamination, better medical treatment, and to be honest, the defensive arms race, at least on the Western Front that we talk about, a different story in the East, kept well apace. So all of these things had a very brief, sometimes 6 or 8 week sort of period in which it was a surprise, after which they really sort of got relegated to battlefield nuisance. The other thing is that the materials that were used as chemical weapons were very seasonal. There were times when it was too hot, too cold, too windy, too wet, too dry. So there were fairly narrow bands of time when they were highly effective. But the defending sides knew that too, so they knew to take more effective countermeasures during the periods of time when they would have their most ideal effectiveness. Which then meant that actually chemical weapons aren't useful all the time. And a weapon that's only useful part of the time loses its cachet to the colonels and the generals. And an artillery shell, that tank over there would have been good in almost every condition.
Yeah.
But a chemical artillery round of the same vintage of that tank would have had maybe 60 days out of the year when it would have been useful. That thing would have been useful about 364 days out of the year. So there you have it.
Yeah. And final question, you're talking about the future of conflict
Yeah.
later on. What if you were Ben Wallace and various other kind of the Western nations, what would you kind of spend money on in terms of weapons going forward?
That's an interesting question because it wasn't the one I was prepared to answer today. Because I'm going to go slightly off piece. Because tonight I'm mostly going to talk about information warfare.
Okay.
All right. So we have to have better capabilities to manage the information aspects of modern warfare, which is things like misinformation and disinformation, propaganda, but also how to, from our own standpoint, because the modern battlefield is flooded with information, how to manage information, whether it's information being used as a weapon or information that we are trying to use as our own, part of, really, information is now part of the logistic supply chain, just like boots and bullets and petrol for the tanks. Managing information, the tools for that are as important as anything else now. They're more important, and they're more important than rifles in a lot of situations. Not that rifles have lost their utility, but modern warfare exists on a lot of strata, and the information strata is extremely important, and I think we need to manage it better.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you very much, Dan, for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the festival.
All right, thank you.